Hello and welcome to the Daily Brief Show by Zerodha. I'm your host Anurag Bansal. Today is Monday, the 16th of September, and I have three interesting stories for you. In the first story, I'll talk about India's skill gap and what the government is doing about it. In the second story, I'll talk about US versus China. And in the third and final story for the day, I'll talk about India's new vehicle scrapping policy. So let's start with the first story. See, in the previous episodes, I've spoken multiple times about India's challenge with creating jobs. Now, the reason why I'm saying this once again today is because the Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship recently published some data on India's skill gap, and that is very interesting for all of us to know. Now, the report starts off by saying that India is in a very unique position with one of the youngest populations in the entire globe. The median age of India is just 28, and 65% of our rapidly growing population is under 35 years of age. Now, this demographic dividend could be a massive advantage to boost India's economic growth. But the catch here is all of this advantage will only pay off if India's workforce has the right skills. So the big question is, what is causing this skill gap? Look, there are few factors here. First, India's economy is changing very fast. New technologies are creating demand for skills that did not even exist a decade ago. But our education system has not really kept pace with it. According to a report by the International Labour Organization or ILO, in some sectors the skill mismatch is crazy. In the IT and tech industry, 80% of employees say that there is a significant skill deficit. In engineering and manufacturing, it is the same story. About 80% of employers are struggling to find workers with the right skill sets. And it's not just startups or tech companies that are feeling the pinch here. Even established giants like Larsen and Toubro are struggling with severe skilled manpower shortages. L&T recently said that it is having a very tough time finding 25,000 workers in engineering and construction and another 20,000 in IT and IT services. Now here you might be wondering, how many jobs are we actually talking about? So our team did some digging and we found out that India's chief economic advisor V. Anantha Nageshwaran recently said that India needs to create roughly 8 million, which means 80 lakh jobs per year. Now this is very hard given our current skills gap. But it gets even more concerning from here. A recent World Bank study estimated that 85.1% of students in India fall below basic skill levels. Even if you consider different states in the country, the range still remains alarming. Between 88 to 90% of Indian children might lack basic skills today. So what is the solution? Well, it's going to take a huge effort from both the public as well as the private sectors. The government is currently pushing for reforms in education and vocational training. They are also launching initiatives to promote entrepreneurship and innovation to boost all of this. Now, one interesting approach here is the Skill India digital platform. With this, the government is aiming to achieve skill education, employment, and entrepreneurship ecosystem integration. It is a step towards making skill acquisition easier and more accessible for Indians. Now, like I mentioned, the private sector also has a very crucial role to play here. Companies need to invest more in training and upskilling their workforce. They also need to work more closely with educational institutions in order to ensure that the curriculum is aligned with industry requirements. The ILO report that I mentioned earlier says that only 36% of Indian companies conduct in-house training as compared to much higher rates in Germany and China. Now that is very low and alarming. Former RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan over the last few years has also spoken many times about India's jobs problem and also has given some useful suggestions. He says that India needs to create jobs across the entire spectrum, not in just high-skill areas like tech, but also in sectors like tourism, retail, hospitality, entertainment, etc., which can absorb a much larger workforce. Raghuram Rajan also pointed out that while India is investing heavily in high-tech sectors like chip manufacturing, these industries do not create enough jobs that are required in the country right now. He also said that a more balanced approach involves investing in stronger engineering colleges, scientific labs, and research centers in order to build a broader base of skills and IPs or intellectual properties that can be applied across multiple sectors. The other thing he emphasized on is the importance of last-mile training. He said that with just 6 to 12 months of targeted training, many graduates could become highly employable even in very complex fields. Now, this approach could help bridge the gap between education and industry needs more effectively. But let's now put this in some global context. But given that India is looking to become a global powerhouse, it is also important to look at all of this from a global context. See, the World Bank report highlights that this skill gap in India is not just an Indian problem, it is a worldwide challenge. Their report also says that about two-thirds or more of the world's young population fails to reach the minimum skill levels that are required to compete in the international economy. Now, this is particularly very concerning because skill differences accounts for about three-fourths of the variation in long-term economic growth between countries. Moving on to the next story of the day, let's talk about US versus China. US politicians from the Republican Party are pushing hard for anti-China laws. Just this week, they passed a bill that would essentially blacklist certain Chinese biotech companies as well as their US subsidiaries. If this bill becomes a law, it would affect Chinese biotech companies in many ways. They could be cut off from US government contracts, might be blocked from receiving certain exports from the US, and could also face difficulties in doing business with American companies in general. Now, this might make life even tougher for Chinese biotech giants like BGI Group and WuXi AppTech. Please ignore my pronunciations if I go wrong. Now, these companies are major players in the global biotech industry and they specialize in areas like geometric sequencing and drug development. And this time, the focus is not on tech hardware or software, but on biotechnology and pharmaceuticals. Republicans are claiming that new restrictions are about national security, and they argue that Chinese biotech companies could potentially access and transfer sensitive biological data to China. Now, this includes genetic information or other health-related data from American citizens, which could be a big threat. But that aside, there also seems to be a political agenda here. See, we are just 50 days away from the US presidential elections, and the Republicans seem to be trying to score political points here. By pushing these anti-China bills, there is a possibility that Republicans want to milk this anti-China sentiment in order to gain voter sympathy. According to Bloomberg Intelligence, this bill has a 70% chance of becoming a law given the strong support it already has. But let me give you some numbers from a recent research center survey. 81% of Americans are now looking at China unfavorably. And this is definitely not new. This sentiment has been getting worse and worse year after year. Back in 2018, only about 48% of Americans had an unfavorable view of China. And this time it has nearly doubled. Now, the reason why this is important is because all these biotech and anti-China measures are not just limited to America. We are also seeing a global shift in how countries approach trades with China, particularly in key industries. I'll give you an idea of the latest happenings. First, China just put a whopping 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, buses, and trucks. They are also considering a 25% tariff on Chinese steel and aluminium. Second, the European Union has imposed tariffs of up to 38% on Chinese electric vehicles. Third, the United States has already hiked customs duty on Chinese EVs to 100% and is now considering raising tariffs on other Chinese goods as well. Fourth, Indonesia is considering slapping tariffs of up to 200% on Chinese textile products. Fifth, India imposed tariffs of up to 30% on some Chinese steel products. Sixth, Brazil has also imposed some tariffs and duties on EVs, steel, etc. But all said and done, why are countries imposing tariffs, you might be wondering? Look, this shift is a part of a bigger story, which is China's rise as the world's manufacturing superpower. China now accounts for over 35% of global manufacturing output, which is more than the next three largest manufacturers combined. China's dominance has real consequences. Countries like the US have lost millions of manufacturing jobs as production has moved to China. And all of this is coinciding with a fundamental shift in world order. Since the end of the Cold War, we have been living in the era of hyper-globalization with rules-based international systems that favors open markets, free trade, free flow of capitalism, and liberal policies. It is all about cooperation, interdependence, and playing nice. But now all of a sudden, the world is looking more like a WWE wrestling ring. In a recent talk, the IMF Deputy Managing Director Geeta Gopinath gave a very interesting stat. She said that there is a significant rise in trade restrictions worldwide over the past few years. In 2022 and 23, there were 3,000 new trade restrictions imposed each year, which was about 3 times the level that was seen in 2019. She also said something that is a little negative though. Global trade is becoming more and more fragmented now. This means countries are no longer trading with countries that they have a rivalry with. For example, China's trade with US is changing very rapidly now. But on the other hand, friendly countries are trading more amongst themselves. What we are essentially seeing here is a shift from international first to nation first politics. Now, all of these are not isolated incidents but a part of a broader pattern. Countries are looking inward and prioritizing their own interests over global cooperation. So, what does all of this mean for the future? Look, the next 30 years will definitely be very, very different from the past 30 years. In all likelihood, there will be a significant change in how countries think of their supply chains, trade relationships, and economic strategies. Now, moving on to the third and the final story of the day, I'll talk about India's new vehicle scrapping policy. Nitin Gadkari, who's India's road transport and highways minister, recently made headlines by calling for bigger discounts on new vehicles for those people who scrap their old ones. Now, this statement is part of an ongoing effort by the government to implement India's national vehicle scrappage policy. They introduced this in 2021. But to understand why this truly matters, let's look at the bigger picture. See, for over a century, we've been burning fossil fuels in order to power the world. This includes our vehicles. This has led to increasing pollution and also climate concerns. In response, India has been gradually tightening its vehicle emission standards. The latest Bharat Stage 6 or BH6 is significantly stricter than the previous versions of it. For your context, Bharat Stage emission standards are regulations in India which aim at reducing air pollution that come from vehicles, and they do this by setting progressively stricter limits on emissions like nitrogen oxide, carbon monoxide, and particulate matter. Now, the true problem here is that many older vehicles on Indian roads were built to meet much lower standards than what are set today. Some estimates suggest that these older cars pollute over 10 to 12 times more than newer models. And this is where the scrappage policy comes in. It aims to remove these older and more polluting vehicles from our Indian roads. Now, on paper, this policy looks greatly promising. It could lead to cleaner air, boost new car sales, create jobs in recycling industry, and provide cheaper raw materials for steel production. But the reality has been a little more complicated. Let's look at it. See, many people are reluctant to give up their old vehicles. New cars are expensive, and many people think their old cars are just working fine. Also, the process of getting a car tested for pollution or scrapped is very challenging today. There are only a handful of testing centers in the country. For example, UP or Uttar Pradesh, with its entire population of 200 million people, has just one center. And setting up more centers is not easy either. It requires significant investment, land, trained personnel, and the right equipment, all of which will take time and resources to develop. Now, this limited infrastructure makes it difficult for people to access testing facilities. The government has tried to make scrapping more attractive by offering incentives like road tax discounts and pushing manufacturers to provide discounts on newer vehicles as well. But so far, these have not been enough to significantly change any user behavior. Now, out of millions of old vehicles, less than 50,000 had been scrapped at government-approved centers as of this year. Now, there is also a thriving informal scrapping industry that is competing against the government-approved centers, and these informal operations are usually easier and quicker to use, even though they might not follow environmental regulations as strictly as the government ones. Now, Gadkari's recent statement, which I mentioned earlier, is an attempt to address these very challenges by pushing for more incentives. The government's hope is that bigger discounts might finally encourage more and more people to participate in their scrapping program. Additionally, the government is also considering revising the scrappage policy to address concerns from people who believe their well-maintained vehicles should not be scrapped solely based on their age. Now, the proposal is to shift from an age-based criteria to one based on pollution levels. So this means for people who argue saying, hey, I've maintained my car very well, so it's not very fair to scrap it, this change would link the scrapping mandate to how much a vehicle actually pollutes instead of just its age. But this would also require a reliable system for issuing pollution certificates in order to ensure fairness as well as effectiveness. In the end, though, the success of the government's scrappage policy will all depend on finding the right balance, which is making it economically attractive for people to upgrade to cleaner vehicles while also ensuring that the infrastructure is in place to make the process more smooth and accessible. Now, moving on, I have a small and special segment for you where I want to talk about some small interesting things happening across the markets and in the business world. Number one, Nazara Technologies is expanding into real money gaming now by acquiring a major stake in PokerBazi's parent company. Now, this move is aimed at capitalizing on the expected 20% annual growth in the real money gaming sector despite recent tax changes. Second, European Central Bank has cut its deposit rates to 3.5% to balance inflation concerns with slow economic growth. They project inflation to reach their 2% target by 2025 despite potential short-term increases due to energy costs. Third, the 2023 ICC Men's Cricket World Cup in India generated a massive $1.39 billion economic impact. It attracted 1.25 million spectators, boosted tourism revenues, and created over 48,000 jobs. And this showcased cricket's economic power in India. Number 4, UAE's state-backed investment company MGX is reportedly in talks to invest in OpenAI as part of a potential $6.5 billion US funding round. Now, this aligns with UAE's focus on AI technologies, and it could value OpenAI at 150 billion US dollars. That brings us to the end of today's news and stories. I hope you found value in today's episode. I hope to see you tomorrow. Take care and goodbye.